Europe in 1212. Children set out on a pilgrimage lasting many months. What is their destination? A monk recorded this incredible event in a chronicle. The children see themselves as chosen ones. They cross the Alps. They have been called to free Jerusalem of the heathens, and they may even have numbered tens of thousands. Rupert, a survivor, tells the monk his story. A movement with carefree beginnings ends in disaster. Unable to cope with the struggle against the elements, their numbers diminish daily. For centuries, the ordeal of these children remained a forgotten chapter of Europe's history, and the question of who was responsible for this fatal mission remained unanswered. The monks' records show that the children were put on ships in Marseille, and that hundreds lost their lives at sea. The survivors, the records continue, were then taken to the slave markets of North Africa. What is the story behind the so-called Children's Crusade, and what do we know about the fate these children suffered? In December of 1230, two men meet in a French monastery. The monk and chronicler Alberic of Trois-Fontaines, and Rupert, one of the few to survive the Children's Crusade to the Holy Land. 20 years after he returned to a Europe plagued by death and disease, Rupert tells his story for the very first time to the astonished monk. Trois-Fontaines decides to record this unprecedented event for posterity. His chronicle becomes a unique documentation of the fate of thousands of children who were impassioned by a mission but were all doomed to fail.
His name was Nicholas, was it not? Your leader. Nicholas, that was his name.
How do you know that?
It was all his fault, wasn't it? He led you astray.
He was only 14 years old himself. I don't wish to talk about it.
Do you really want something like that to happen again?
No.
Then I shall write down what you tell me, so others can read it and learn from it.
But I've forgotten everything.
You lie.
We believed he was a prophet from God.
Who? Nicholas?
You should have heard him speak. His eyes lit up, and his voice rang out like that of an archangel.
Thousands of pilgrims flock to the cathedral daily to pray before the relics of the Magi. The young especially, Rupert among them, are captivated by the stirring words of the preacher.
It was as if the voice of God was speaking to us. "Do not despair," he cried. "I will lead you to the Holy Land. We will need no ships to cross the sea. Christ has appeared to me, and he will part the waves, and we shall reach the holy city on dry land. And you shall want for nothing, because God our Father is with us. I swear to you, my Lord, we believed every word he said."
The Herzog August Library in Wolfenbüttel, northern Germany. Here we find medieval manuscripts recounting the mysterious events in the year 1212. Among them is also Trois-Fontaines' chronicle. One chronicle from Trier states that the children left for Jerusalem under the sign of the cross to come to the aid of the Holy Land. Their parents had locked them in their houses, but they still managed to follow this self-proclaimed Messiah, Nicholas. For the chroniclers, he remains a shadowy, mysterious figure, this Nicholas of Cologne, who was so idolized by Rupert and his friends.
Every day, more and more people came to join Nicholas. They could sense the presence of God, just as we did. We shall liberate Jerusalem. We, the young, the children, the poor and oppressed, shall march to the Holy Land with God's blessing. And we shall be victorious because we are pure of heart. And everyone, every single one of us, really believed him.
They are driven by the idea of going to those places where Jesus Christ lived. They carry with them the conviction that they will free Jerusalem. They have the will to do so, but they want to achieve it solely by means of their faith. They believe in their divine mission.
The Chronicle of Alberic of Troisfontaine. It tells us that at the same time Nicholas and his followers are leaving Cologne, something very similar is happening in France. The place is Cloyes, on the River Loire, 200 kilometers from Paris. A village of farmers and artisans. Here, the shepherd boy Stephen is born. The chroniclers describe him as the child of impoverished parents. Stephen grows up in the village community and has to provide for himself from an early age. Later, as if from nowhere, he will suddenly appear and, just like Nicholas, will bring droves of children and adolescents under his spell. Legend has it that Stephen is friendly and popular. The people of Cloyes, and above all their children, trust and believe him. Stephen is deeply pious and devout. Sources report of his love of processions, singing, and prayer. And he is a talented preacher, just like Nicholas. He tells his devoted listeners that Jesus appeared to him one night in the fields and gave him the task of liberating the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem together with his young followers. They gathered here, the chapel of Notre-Dame-d'Iron, part of a Benedictine monastery. This is where Stephen's children's crusade began. Another church in Cloyes, Saint-Georges. Stained glass windows depict the march of Stephen and the children, their hopes and their ordeals. They are one of the very few pictorial presentations of the little Crusaders, created centuries after their fatal expedition. In the year 1212, two completely separate movements form. In France, children march from Cloyes-en-the-Loire to Marseille. In Germany, the route takes them from Cologne across the Alps to Genoa.
It seems rather mysterious, but those involved in the Children's Crusades had information about the numerous routes, the trading routes, the footpaths and pilgrim routes. The many people who used these routes, the artisans, the peasants, the nobles and even the travelling whores, spoke about them in the inns and taverns in the evenings, and the information was picked up by the children and young people.
The rallying cry, "Onward to Palestine," is quite familiar to children in the year 1212. Jerusalem is a magical word, because this is the age of the Crusades. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of Christianity's most sacred sites. But here, since the 7th century, the crescent has ruled over the cross. In autumn 1095, the greatest propaganda machine of all time is set in motion. Jerusalem must be freed from the infidel. This is the slogan of the century. The greatest mass army the Western world had ever seen began its march to the east. Behind all this was Pope Urban II. His call to arms was answered by Christians from all over Europe. The Pope promises them remission of their sins and eternal life, but also the treasures of the Orient. The journey takes months and many die en route, but the prospects of salvation and rapid wealth spur the knights on to overcoming the greatest hardships. The army of Crusaders reaches Jerusalem in June 1099, and a deadly battle ensues. Siege towers weighing many tons are constructed. The walls of Jerusalem are regarded as impregnable, but they fall apart in the barrage from the catapults. The Saracens were no match for the heavily armed elite troops from Europe, and after a swift battle, Jerusalem falls into the hands of the Crusaders. In a frenzy of bloodlust, the emaciated victors storm Jerusalem, massacring children, women, Jews and Muslims alike, leaving 30,000 people dead. After this conquest, prestige and religious credibility of the Holy Campaign are lost.
The subject of Crusades was an old one, but just as old were the observations of what had really happened there. Robbery, plundering and murder. It was all about possession. That was a perversion that became a legend, and the children knew it. And these children and young people were idealistic and said, "No, that's not the way. We can do it better. We are the renewal of the Crusade spirit." And so when a youthful leader comes along, a movement is born, a movement for children and young people.
The children find the warlike saber rattling of their heavily armed predecessors abhorrent. Their crusade is a silent, highly idealistic enterprise. Rupert and his fellow campaigners are full of illusions.
In July 1212 we set off. There were a few thousand that followed Nicholas and our cross. There were children and adolescents, but also adults, teachers with their charges, old people, even nobles and monks were with us. And everyone prayed for us, also those who stayed at home. Many had left their families, their fathers and mothers, and nothing and no one could stop them leaving.
The manuscripts in the Wolfenbüttel library speak of the children's enthusiasm, even fanaticism. Parents locked them up, but they broke free to join the march, to be able to take part in this divine mission.
This children's crusade is the first authentic example of a genuinely popular crusade. It not only differs fundamentally from the official crusades, but was in fact the complete opposite of what they stood for. These children were steeped in the belief that they were a kind of chosen people. This idea was due to the fact that the powerful had failed, and as the children saw it, the reason for this failure lay in their depraved lifestyles, in the guilt they had burdened upon themselves, and also in their pride and arrogance.
The First Crusade too had once begun as a service to God, but it ended in a barbaric bloodbath. The initial idea of liberating Christianity's holy places becomes a cynical pretext for a ruthless conquest. In the mosques today, there is nothing to show that the Crusaders once erected their barracks here. But as furious as the beginnings to Christian rule were, its duration was brief. It was not even to last a century. In late summer 1187, Sultan Saladin stands before the gates of the Holy City at the head of one of the most fearsome armies of the time. The legendary general finally succeeds in storming the walls of the city in that autumn. The final battle. Those believing themselves safe under the protection of God were soon robbed of this delusion. This time, it was the Crusaders under their heavy armor who were helpless against the Saracens' agility. Their battle techniques are outdated. Many Crusaders are lethargic, the victims of years of gluttony, and they are outnumbered. Jerusalem falls. The triumphantly celebrated crusade is a miserable failure. Many thousands lose their lives in the divine mission. They perish wretchedly, and very few succeed in returning to Europe alive.
He too believed he had heard the call of God. One of my brothers, Now he lies here rotting, fallen in the Holy Land.
And why did the mighty knights not succeed in freeing Jerusalem from the infidel?
I know not. It was not the Lord's will.
At the end of the great scheme to liberate the holy places lies the humiliation of defeat. Jerusalem is once again in the hands of the Muslims. The children are convinced they know the reasons why the enterprise failed. The armed crusaders had left the path God had intended. With this in mind, they now put forward their own idea. Dominance and possessions are not what they want. This sets a completely new tone, putting purity of faith before power and material values.
Poverty, rags, and childish innocence were the insignia, the symbols of the new change for the better. This was helped by religious orders which in similar fashion were trying to say, church pomp is wrong, and all the greed for power is wrong. We have to start afresh. And as children, they could put this across in an especially credible manner, because as children, on top of everything else, they were young.
I could tell you who assisted you and why. But I do not believe you would understand anyway.
As you wish. There were monks who came to Nicholas. They were not like the ones we had known until then. Not so...
Not so fat? You can continue speaking. I am not one who sees heresy in every word.
They preached so beautifully that ownership is a sin, and that Jesus had owned nothing, not even a roof over his head, and that we should show the church what it really means to follow Jesus.
At the beginning of the 13th century, various movements arise propagating voluntary poverty as the essentially Christian ideal. For them, a Christian life means abstention, renouncing possessions and consumption. Their asceticism is the living opposition to the luxury of church dignitaries. They believe it's the only way Christians can return to genuine piety. Historians are now certain that this asceticism movement at least influenced the Children's Crusades or even took them over completely.
And now this asceticism movement suddenly discovers the Crusade idea and appropriates it. And then a tract appears, but not from among the Children's Crusaders themselves, but from within the circles of this asceticism movement, calling for the recapture of Jerusalem, listing precisely these criteria, that the church-backed crusades of nobles have failed and that now, in any attempts to recapture the holy city, Christ would only bestow victory on the poor. And that now seems to me to be precisely the vocabulary the Children's Crusade puts into practice.
There was a girl. Her name was Marie. She was no older than 11 and had stolen a pear, a single stringy pear. He was so big and strong, and she was so small. He seized her, threw her to the ground, and then...
The treatment of children in the 13th century is strict and unrelenting. That makes adolescents like the young Rupert very receptive to the promise of happiness and freedom.
And once your Nicholas had accepted his calling as a prophet of the Lord, he spoke with the tongue of angels, but in such a way that all could now understand him. And more children followed him as a herd of sheep follows their shepherd. That's how it was with the French boy, Stephen. Did your parents approve of your staying with this Nicholas?
Of them, they were just happy to have one less mouth to feed. It is not pleasant, my lord, to be born the son of a soap boiler, not a day without hunger, and not a day without beatings.
In the 13th century, children are small adults, with all the duties of a hard-working day. To step out of line means punishment. Children are hungry mouths that have to work for their food. So, in the ears of such poor wretches, exhausted from their work in the fields and regularly beaten by adults, what must the prospect of a land where milk and honey flow have sounded like? The chroniclers report of their willingness to cut all ties and leave their homes and families behind them for attempting new life.
The overall situation of children and people in the 12th and 13th centuries was characterized by rapid population growth, resulting in increasing numbers of children and young people. Their social prospects, however, were very limited. Childhood was not like it is today. It meant work, hardship and hunger. And in this situation, despite the religious fascination, there were of course enormous social pressures too. All this together was a powerful driving force.
It was so hot, like a furnace. Nothing to eat, nothing to drink. The river had dried up.
Lynch law is commonplace, even for stealing food, for it was a time of famine. The year 1212 begins with a wet winter, followed by a dry spring and a hot summer. Bad harvests are the consequence. The children have to rely on charity. The people in the towns and villages have nothing to eat themselves and are suddenly faced with throngs of hungry children and adolescents. For the local people, they must have seemed like a plague of locusts. Most were already weak and undernourished when they set off. Their hunger is now accompanied by the exertions of the march, the heat, infections, and disease. It is an expedition without knowledge or logistics. The daily struggle for food alone would have been enough to sap the children's physical and psychological energy almost completely.
Boiled nettles and a few acorns was all we could find. She was too weak to even go a single step further. She was going to die. I was mad with desperation, but she was not afraid. It was as if she had had a vision. She saw the heavenly Jerusalem, the holy city. Just as it says in the Bible, and the building of the wall of it was of jasper, and the city was pure gold.
Early death was an everyday occurrence in the Middle Ages. Science has proved many romantic conceptions of the Middle Ages to be false. Anyone reaching adulthood is lucky. Old age is a rarity. Vienna, the Natural History Museum. Each of these skulls represents a very personal fate. The museum houses one of the world's largest collections of human bones. The mortal remains of people from all ages are stored here. Men, women, and children. The impressive museum has over 60,000 skeletons, equivalent to the population of a small town. These skulls are a mine of information. It's astonishing how much modern pathology can glean from one single specimen. Together with Vienna scientists, we want to construct an individual fate. From among these exhibits, we choose the skeleton of a medieval teenager. who lived and died in the same town. This is what a participant in the Children's Crusade might have looked like. An individual case, but nonetheless representative for an entire generation. The skeleton of this child is now to be subjected to the full scope of modern pathological examination methods. How old was it? What did it eat? How did it live? What did it suffer from? How did it die? Around the thigh bones, the pathologist and historian Karin Wilczke discovers something unusual, a kind of deposit on the bone surface. It can also be found on the teeth, different symptoms of one and the same phenomenon, hunger.
From the example of the bones we've seen of this 12 to 14-year-old child from the early Middle Ages, we can see deposits on the long bones of the thigh and the tibia and fibula, which indicate the occurrence of bleeding during lifetime. This is caused by nutritional deficiencies, such as a lack of vitamin C, for instance, over a long period. This deficiency slows down or weakens the immune system, and the slightest infection can result in death.
Examination under the microscope confirms the analysis. This child was malnourished, displaying symptoms we know today mostly from the Sahel region. The child, however, didn't live in Africa. It lived here, but 800 years too early. Tiny furrows like very fine lines. Hunger caused the child's bones to waste away. The examination result shows it never reached adulthood. And this child is not an isolated case.
This child comes from a town population where people lived very closely together. There were also famines. Illness could spread quickly and universally. Our experience shows that 50% of children died before they even reached adulthood.
Hunger, disease, even the death of their companions did not seem to have distracted the children from their goal. Was it the promise of paradise, or was it that their faith fed them the energy to survive? Those who were physically fit enough marched on, and sometimes received gifts. Monks may have given them a pig, enabling them to trade a little, or keep themselves in food for a few days or a week. They march on without the slightest idea of time. Will they reach their destination in a month or even in a week? Each day, the holy city of Jerusalem seems closer. What effect would the spectacle of a Gothic cathedral have had on these children? Was this not the sight of heaven on earth? Was this huge, light-flooded space not a taste of the paradise that awaited them in Palestine? For these children, God was a familiar authority. In messages of unknown origin and in celestial signs, He had manifested Himself to them.
Did you witness visions or other supernatural apparitions? The falling sickness or demonic possession? Did anyone speak in tongues? Did manuscripts appear which Christ Himself had written? Speak. In France, such things happened every day.
The heavens were suddenly ablaze. God spoke to us all, that much was clear. It was as if He wanted to open up the heavens and descend from a great ball of fire. We were afraid, but Nicholas wept for joy. In this night he said to us, God had given him a sign.
What had happened in this April night of the year 1212? What did the night sky look like in Cologne and Cloyes in that spring? Did anything unusual happen? Astronomical abnormalities such as constellations of stars which give rise to particular celestial phenomena? What was behind these ominous flames in the heavens? The planetarium in Bochum. Astronomers are working on the most advanced star projectors in the world. We are about to embark on a journey through time. We programmed the computer to the location Cologne, 1212, mid-April. The orbits of the celestial bodies are known. The paths are mathematical formulas. The course of the stars over 800 years, compressed into a few moments. This is what the night sky in 1212 looked like. This is what the children saw. Nothing unusual. For the period between 1208 and 1220, the astronomers check for the occurrence of supernova phenomena and comets in the celestial sphere over Europe. Again, the result is negative. Yet Nicholas and Stephen could have experienced a highly unusual celestial phenomenon, which they interpreted as a sign from God.
The best explanation is perhaps the polar lights, because they move very quickly and have perhaps the closest resemblance to the impression of fire in the sky.
The polar lights, a rare but explainable phenomenon. 800 years ago, however, a religious message.
For the people at that time, God spoke through nature, and lights were, of course, especially impressive. The northern lights, or lightning with thunder. And for children who were even more impressionable, the effect was even stronger. And so there's now this vision, the idea that God is speaking to them, saying, "Begin, go, it's the right thing." It was confirmation that this impulse came from God, and we are chosen to do His bidding and march.
Setting forth from the Rhine plain around Cologne, leaving the safety and familiarity of their towns and villages, they are confronted with mighty mountainous landscapes. Rupert and his companions have travelled 700 kilometres.
It was the mightiest thing I had ever seen, the huge mountains. Their peaks reaching up into the clouds, and it seemed to us as if their pathways led directly up to heaven.
How might the children have perceived these mountain ranges and the deep valleys? As sublime nature, a creation of the very God whose bidding they were doing? At this point, they were blissfully unaware that they were heading for disaster.
The children were overwhelmed by the Alps. They came from flat regions and had never seen such landscapes, had never seen pictures of them and had no imagination of them at all. And now they were there, experiencing nature, but also, and especially, experiencing God. This sheer magnificence was God speaking to them, and so could only confirm them, even intoxicate them in their belief.
Wolfenbüttel Library. What little we know of the Children's Crusade is kept archived here. Only written chronicles provide some indication of the drama that has left no traces at all. Concealed behind armoured steel, the original manuscripts from the 13th century, commentaries and chronicles about the Crusade of the Children, a collection of immeasurable historical value. Remarkably, the reports of the Children's Crusade are contradictory. Some praise the children's idealism, others warn of their presumptuousness. Sometimes the children are held up as an example for adults, and then again as mere tools of Satan. It reads as if a dispute between secular opposition and church authority is being fought out here in medieval Latin and calligraphic perfection.
The official church was astounded by this movement and taken completely by surprise. Who are these children? What do they want? What do they think they're doing? This obscure, ragged rabble, do they really believe they can succeed where kings, nobles and knights had failed? So the children were met with disdain, contempt and sometimes even wickedness, which brings in the devil, the answer to all questions. Ultimately, it's always the work of the devil.
The written word is a weapon. An unintentional mistake, or the conscious alteration of a text. A document, for example, can mean affluence or misery. With this weapon, I can destroy people, even beyond the grave. Destroy ideas.
These manuscripts are not historical records. They contain no scientific objectivity. These documents and sources pose many questions. Did the Children's Crusade break some taboo? Because they were not authorized by the Pope? Because they propagated fundamental Christian poverty? Because they criticized the pomp of the Church? Among medieval chroniclers, researchers have made out two distinct camps, pro and contra.
The phenomenon we have here is that in the reports of the Children's Crusade, chroniclers from poor backgrounds, those from within the mendicant or ascetic orders, the Cistercians for instance, wrote very favorably with great benevolence. On the other hand, authors from the conservative orders, the rich prelate orders or from episcopal circles were highly critical and dismissed the Children's Crusades as the work of the devil.
In the children's daily struggle, the ideas being disputed here were not their greatest priority. Without any help, they were facing one single enemy, the cruelty of nature.
It got colder and colder. The little ones simply lay down and died. Many still only had their summer clothes and had rags wrapped around their feet. The icy wind tore right through them and stopped them in their tracks. We simply counted our steps, and in the end, everything disappeared as if covered by a white cloth. I saw children in their bare feet in the icy snow, their toes black as coal. Every day a small part of us died. We were crossing a white hell, and in our heads the devil spoke, saying, "Lie down and sleep. Sleep, for God has forgotten you." And they believed him.
The sources provide no information at all on what really happened in the Alps. The children were certainly the victims of their own carefree abandon. Why did no one stop them, warn them, or equip them, or offer them any help? These questions will have to remain unanswered. This children's march was undertaken beyond the scope of ecclesiastical power and the Church's protection. They had risked everything and were left completely to their own devices.
Their shoes and clothing were miserable. They had little or no food, no help, wild animals, and they didn't even know which way to go. Where was God's help? One after another they perished. Despair was all that remained of their Christian enthusiasm and their great ideal.
How did Christianity's supreme pontiff, Pope Innocent III, react to this grand ideal or to the tragedy the young pilgrims suffered? What do the chroniclers tell us about the voice of God's representative on earth? Does he give the children of the cross his papal blessing? Here too, the accounts are contradictory.
The conservative clerical sources report of the Pope's hostility to the enterprise. He's reported to have said, "Now these poor children have unknowingly taken the Crusade vow, and this vow is binding. Only they are incapable of fulfilling it, and now he must oblige them to perform the Crusade once they reach adulthood." Words of admonishment, as it were, against the Children's Crusade. The more sympathetic sources, however, from mendicant and ascetic orders, express a totally different view. The words they put into innocents' mouth are, "Look at what these children do, and we, the clergy, the nobility, we sleep."
800 kilometers along the River Loire to Marseille. That is the route the French children take. Just before they reach the Mediterranean, great trepidation may well have taken hold. Will the waters really part?
Stretch out thine hand over the sea, and divide it in the middle. That's not the way it was it not? Nothing was divided. What do you think Stephen felt on reaching the Mediterranean Sea?
They will have been as hurt and distressed as we are.
Let us imagine the scenario. Emaciated, exhausted, kept alive solely by the prospect of the Holy Land, the world suddenly fell apart around them. Stephen's prophecy is not fulfilled. The sea remains as it is. No heavenly sign, not the slightest indication. Disappointment turns to horror and dismay. Is Stephen, their prophet, a charlatan? He promised them heaven on earth, but they went through hell. They believed Stephen, and many paid for this faith with their lives. How great must their disappointment and bitterness have been? Suddenly everything is called into question. Was the entire march, the hardships, the dead, all to no avail? And Stephen, the little prophet, did he too finally lose all hope in the face of this desperate situation? Was his divine vision no more than a delusion? Had there been no heavenly command at all? One common ideal had held the multitude of children together. But what happens when confidence gives way to despair? Questions arise. Have they followed a swindler? Are they victims of the devil? Have they even put their salvation at risk? It is conceivable that they were not prepared to give up on their ideal so quickly. So they resort to pleading, lamenting, and beseeching in order to beg for the promised miracle. And suddenly, God seems to hear their pleas. The miracle occurs. Jerusalem once again seems to be within reach. What happens now is documented in the Chronicle of Alberic of Trois-Fontaines. The rescuers are Hugo Ferreus and William Porcus, two merchants from Marseille. They offer to take the children across the sea in their ships. God sending ships. That's how it must have seemed to the desperate children. Their miracle actually happens. September 1212. Hugo Ferreus and William Porcus are prepared to take the children on their ships to Palestine for the sake of God and without price. Hugo Ferreus and William Porcus are merchants with trading posts in North Africa. The chronicles tell of 7 ships. They are stout, big-bellied trading vessels, built for barrels, sacks and crates, but not for passengers. 7 ships for 5,000 children. Everyone wants a place on board, a passage to the promised land. That leads to struggles breaking out for the limited space. Those who fall overboard drown. Others are left behind in Marseille. Those who do get on board consider themselves lucky. None suspect that they are now the merchandise of slave traders. Were Phareus and Porcus really the divine helpers, the allies sent by heaven to assist them in their quest to liberate Jerusalem? Though they have their doubts, the prospect of soon being in Jerusalem, in paradise, blinds them to their fate. But their ordeal on board is tortuous. The children must endure the sheer hell of the sea journey. There are over 500 on each of the vessels. In high seas, they have to go below deck. Crammed together like cattle, there's scarcely any air to breathe. The overcrowding on the ships will have made it impossible to provide an adequate supply of food. The stench is unbearable. Seasickness and infections spread. And yet again they are confronted with the cruelty of nature. Off Sardinia, a storm brews that soon becomes a hurricane. In such enormous seas, the children must have been in a permanent state of mortal fear. 2 of the ships are eventually smashed into the rocky cliffs of San Pietro and sink, taking the lives of more than 1,000 children. The remaining ships set course for North Africa. There, the surviving children are sold on the slave markets. They left their homes and their families to free the Holy Sepulchre from the Saracens, but they end up in North Africa as the slaves of princes and merchants. It is said that 400 children are fortunate enough to pass into the possession of a caliph, who treats them well out of respect for their religion. Others die a martyr's death because they are not prepared to reject the Christian faith. None of the children ever cast eyes on Jerusalem. In public consciousness, the children have been forgotten for centuries. There are no memorials in the squares of our cities to recall their tragedy. Ironically, we owe the only monument to their existence to those children who lost their lives on the cliffs off San Pietro. Here on San Pietro, 20 years after the ships went down, Pope Gregory IX built a church, which he named the Chapel of the New Innocents. A gesture of reconciliation, perhaps, for the transgressions of his predecessor. Over time, the chapel fell into ruin before being rediscovered in the 19th century. Apart from this tiny chapel and a few pages of written manuscript, there is nothing to remember those thousands of children who were determined to accomplish a divine mission and in doing so lost their lives or were enslaved. The only traces remaining are kept by the priest of the little chapel.
The only trace is the one you have seen here beneath the church. The children drowned off the coast of our island and were washed up onto the shore by the sea. Their remains were gathered together and buried here as historical testimony. It's what the Pope himself wanted. So they are buried down here, and obviously, with the passage of time, not very much is left of them. But we know that they're here, below us.
Bone dust is all that remains. Very few succeeded in returning to Europe. And it's to one of them that we owe the very little that we know.
You were one of those who survived as a slave of the infidel. Did you have to reject your faith?
Have you seen the great desert?
No.
I have seen it.
Was it worth the price? All the dead? And the long years of slavery? You were marching to your doom.
We all have to die. Even the monks. Some sooner, some later. What is better, my lord? Leading a miserable life, knowing that death can still come every day, or
living as a slave?
Knowing what kind of world lies beyond the horizon.
Thousands of children lose their lives for an ideal. They believe they are doing God's bidding and endure insufferable agonies. Even today, this unique chapter in history moves our emotions, for it tells a story of deep medieval piety, but also one of poverty, misery, and violence. They were hoping for a paradise on earth. They dreamed of not having to go hungry, of being free. And the legacy of the Children's Crusades? By peaceful means, armed only with a great idea, they wanted to set an example for the world.